Now, for John Dewey, apparently his theory is that experience essentially is narrative. That is to say, you remember a thing by the subjective involvement you have in it, in which you desire something, and there are elements that either come to your aid literally in accomplishing it, or defeat your possibilities one way or the other. And so you have a kind of struggle with something in order to have an actual experience. And the actual experience has got a narrative form. And I'm discontent with his account of it, which was a little bit my hyperbolic account of John Dewey's account of an experience. He is not happy with that. He's not satisfied with that as his idea of how to represent what an experience is. So he says, imagine a rock, a little rock at the top of a hill. Imagine it as having a point of view. What would its point of view be? The point of view essentially is to achieve a resting place that is the most pleasant resting place it could possibly find so that it could stay there forever. The immortalization of the rock in the pleasure of its position in the world. But then comes a rainstorm, and the rain floods the area, and the rivulets pick up the little rock and dislodge it from its space, and it starts to roll down the hill. And then it encounters on the way a variety of obstacles, but it seems to be intent on coming to rest at some place, and the only place it could come to rest would be at the bottom of the hill. So the rock keeps trying to come down the right way, but there are other rocks in its way, obstacle rocks. They kick it in the shins. They try to hold on to it, they interfere with it, it dodges them. It's a very clever little rock. It pirouettes and it moves away like a ballerina dancing. I guess I'm being influenced by Elroy. It creates a grand jeté over which it leaps in order to get closer. It pirouettes, it comes down, then it also does little bourrée-like steps. And this little rock finally comes to a resting place at the bottom of the hill and feels it has achieved final victory. Now, this kind of theory of narrative theory of experience seems to me a little bit too funny. But the thing about Dewey is he's trying to make it a concrete psychological genre, the genre of experience. Now, when you think of it that way, the question is that what we mean when we say experience? Or do we really mean that something that we have actually participated in consists of a series of experience? In other words, it may have the narrative form that it does, but the issue of the word experience is that it refers to something that's not theory, that's not content, pure concept. It's some kind of understanding, it seems to represent, for most people who use it, some kind of apprehension of reality that is greater in its significance than an abstract account of it. So that, in effect, a first-hand experience, which is sometimes the word used for it, what is first-hand? What is a first-hand experience? Is an experience that you have directly. And it sometimes seems to suggest that it's never been had by anybody else before, because this is not generically formed. In other words, it's an experience because it has never been formed before. This seems a little excessive, the idea of experience. But I've often asked myself, what do I mean when I say experience? Because I use the word often when talking about inadequate critical writing. The critical writing seems to come from people who have had very little experience of the things they're talking about. Well, there's a great deal of such talk that literally seems as if, particularly in the arts, which usually it sounds as if these people have never really known how an artwork ever got made. One of the things is that people are very quick to tell you what an artwork means. I once taught a whole class to find out how how artworks go about meaning something. And we weren't sure by the end whether we really had a clear idea of it. But the point is, there are people perfectly willing to tell you what an artwork means, though they may never tell you how it gets to mean it, or how it lets you know that that's what I mean. I mean, it's as if an artwork gets interrogated, and you say to the artwork, "What do you mean?" And the artwork tries to tell you the answer. "I mean this." That doesn't count. That doesn't sort of square with my experience, to use the word. I mean, you start to do something, you're attracted to some possibility. I was attracted to the possibility of a poetry of thinking. That is the notion of the human mind taking its shape, or shaping things, trying to shape things, as it were, to sort of throw light upon them in certain ways, to evoke certain possibilities. Like, if you have an artwork like, let's say, Eleanor's imaginary ballerinas. We know they're imaginary ballerinas. She's trying to decide what herself is. It decides herself is a series of genres. One genre is a ballerina. Another genre is another genre is a king. Another genre is a nurse. And you look at these things and say, well, she's decided she consists of 3 genres. Or 3.5. At one point you have a black ballerina. Well, that's, just it's not a full genre yet. It's just an impossible genre at the time it was written, but it's not a full genre. And so you wind up saying to yourself, how did she come to this? She didn't come to it all at once. She couldn't have come to it all at once. She took one step, and then she took a second step, and then she took another step, the way artists make artworks or poets make poems. You start with something. You may start with some sort of image of something. She started 100 booths. She sort of imagined she saw 100 booths, facing the sea. Why 100 booths facing? If you're, like a certain kind of critic, you say, well, what the hell does she mean by 100 booths facing the sea? Then they would come up with a theoretical account of what it means, why facing the sea is different from having their back to the sea. 100 booths were not turning away from the sea, they were facing the sea. They were facing the immeasurable and the unmeasured, the chaotic, and no, she had 100 booths facing the sea. She said to me one morning, David, what do you think of 100 booths facing the sea? And I said, I don't know. I've never seen them before. She said, well, that's what I'm going to do. And I figured she would do something intelligent with them. So what she did, she lined them up on the beach and they faced the sea. And there was the fact that she didn't know what they were going to do either, but it occurred to her, once she had 100 booths facing the sea, she wanted more 100 booths pictures because that didn't seem to exhaust the energy-generating character of the work. Work sometimes, you're on a roll when a work of yours suggests more things to be done. When it is a point of closure, it's a work you got to get out of. And because the closure is a defeat for the artist. So she decided she would have a series of such images. And then she started to have the images. She didn't know what those images would necessarily be. She didn't know that it was going to turn into something like a picaresque little novel. There were 100 booths going to the bank. It's a nice idea to have 100 booths go to the bank. And what do they do? Withdraw feet? I mean, what do you do with 100? What do 100 booths have to do with the bank? Well, it cost money to buy the 100 booths. Were they there to pay back the cost of having been bought? I mean, they were ransomed from the shelves of an Army Navy store and turned into adventurers and felt liberated. And so they felt they were paying Eleanor back for the $100 that she spent buying. I think it was $2 a boot or something like that. And so were they going to pay back Eleanor by going to the bank and withdrawing funds for her so that she could send the news to everybody, look, 100 booths have been liberated from the shelves. It's a way of thinking about it. It happens in parts. Now, as an artist, I've always had a taste for thinking of things in relation to what might be a plausible example to see if that would make sense, if it would make sense to consider something like that. And I was being questioned by a very good poet named Don Wellman of a kind of Olson background. He asked me why I had abandoned collage for a reinterpretation of narrative. And the question posed that way defeats an answer. He's a smart guy, but the point of it is, when you ask the question that way, you can't get an intelligent answer, because the why suggests too much simplicity in it. What I was suggesting was that the development of American media, probably globally, produced a mass media version of collage, that the formation of images on television is essentially creates anti-narrative structures. Because what happens is, given the system of financing in which commercials are paid for, the people who go to watch television don't go to pay admission and determine their relationship by paying for admission. The images are subsidized, or the video is subsidized by sponsors who pay money to have their crap more or less being represented on television, right? And these little films that represent, toothpaste or condoms or Cadillacs are wrapped around and into the middle of the otherwise straightforward entertainment forms. So if you have a narrative form, if you have a story type program, whatever kind, it will be cut in three places. It will have something immediately coming in ahead of it that will not belong to it, and it'll have something in the middle of it that will not belong to it, and you have something at the end that will not belong to it. And then within the things that don't belong to it are things that have the same generic structure as the thing they're cutting into, but with different material. And then you have things in which the station people advertise their own character, their own network, and future programs. So there's a collage of that stuff that shows up before a program begins, and in the middle of it, and at the end of it. And you have this whole set of collage-like structures that are created by television's financing system that produces collage. And the collage, which was a very rich and extremely promising development, because it was a form of reference without representation. It was sort of like, it was representation by associative means. And when you looked at that kind of, in other words, it was essentially produced by what's called the principle of economy. That is, the meaning of a collage was essentially the associated, the connotational aspects of a collage. So in 1912, Picasso, or 1913, Picasso, probably better, Picasso would be a mixture of things that were fragments of things he wanted to refer to, and connected, juxtaposed against the fragments of drawings that represented the things. And more radically, Schwitters, who was a much more radical collagist than Picasso, is an assemblage of mixtures of garbage, that is, things that have deteriorated and fallen apart, poetically called Merzbau, Merz structures or craft structures. They were put together and celebrated the freewheeling principle, the meaning-making principle of autonomy, which essentially is connotational freedom. And it felt as connotational freedom is one thing, but when it becomes connotationally appropriate, that's when you begin to worry about whether you're working the right way. As soon